Chapter number 11 of the Life of Captain James Cook, the Circumnavigator, by Arthur Kitson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter number 11, 1770 to 1771. New Guinea to England. The water on the New Guinea coast was very shallow and kept them far out in running westward, but on the 3rd of September they got a little nearer in, so Cook decided to attempt a landing, and then to leave, as he considered it was only wasting valuable time to go over ground that had already been explored by the Dutch. Banks says that the crew were rather sickly. They were pretty far gone with the longing for home, which the physicians have gone so far as to esteem a disease under the name of nostalgia. Indeed, I can hardly find anybody in the ship clear of its effects, but the captain, Dr. Solander, and myself, and we three have ample constant employment for our minds, which I believe to be the best if not the only remedy for it. They were also on short allowance of food, which would necessarily have a depressing effect, and when they learnt that Cook would return to civilization where fresh supplies could be obtained, there was a marked improvement in general health. Calling in at the island of Savu, some supplies were obtained, and the country is described as very lovely, although there had been no rain for 7 months. The contrast with the monotonous and barren-looking country of New Holland was very marked. At Batavia. According to strict orders from the Admiralty, Cook on the 30th of September collected all logs and journals that had been kept on board the ship, and enjoined everyone that they were on no account to divulge where they had been on their arrival at Batavia. Off Java Head, the main topsail was split in a squall, and Cook remarks that all his sails are now in such a condition that they will hardly stand the least puff of wind. No observations had been possible since leaving Savu, and the strong western current had thrown out their dead reckoning, causing them to run past the Straits of Sunda. But picking themselves up on the 1st of October, they got into the Straits, and after a wearisome beat-up, arrived in Batavia on the 10th, and Hicks was sent on shore to announce their arrival and offer an apology for failing to salute the Dutch flag in a proper manner, the reason being that they had only 3 guns available. The ship was thoroughly surveyed, and on the carpenter's report, Cook applied to the Governor for a convenient place in which to heave down and repair, and for permission to purchase such stores as might be necessary. Every assistance was promised, and on Cook's finding a difficulty in getting any private person to cash the bills he would have to draw for his expenses, the Governor ordered the officer in charge of the port to supply whatever amount might be necessary. During a heavy thunderstorm on the 12th, a Dutch Eastern Indiaman, about 2 cables away from the Endeavour, had mainmast split all to shivers. The Endeavour was also struck, and in all probability we should have shared the same fate as the Dutchman, had it not been for the electric chain which we had but just before got up. This carried the lightning or electric matter over the side clear of the ship. On the 25th of October, Cook reopened communications with the Admiralty, forwarding to Mr. Stephens, by the Dutch East Indiaman Cronenberg, Captain F. Calgar, a packet containing a copy of his journal, sold to Mr. John Corner in 1890, charts of the South Seas, New Zealand, and the east coast of Australia. He also wrote a letter giving an outline of his voyage up to date, and concludes, "In this journal I have with undisguised truth and without gloss inserted the whole transactions of the voyage, and made such remarks and have given such descriptions of things as I thought was necessary, in the best manner I was capable of. Although the discoveries made in the voyage are not great, yet I flatter myself that they are such as may merit the attention of their lordships, and although I have failed in discovering the so much talked of southern continent, which perhaps do not exist, and which I myself had much at heart, yet I am confident that no part of the failure of such discovery can be laid to my charge. Had we been so fortunate not to have run ashore, much more would have been done in the latter part of the voyage than what was, but as it is, I presume this voyage will be found as complete as any before made to the South Seas on the same account. Praises his crew. The plans I have drawn of the places I have been at were made with all the care and accuracy that time and circumstances would admit of. Thus far I am certain that the latitude and longitude of few parts of the world are better settled than these. In this I was very much assisted by Mr. Green, who let slip no one opportunity for making observations for settling the longitude during the whole course of the voyage, and the many valuable discoveries made by Mr. Banks and Mr. Solander in natural history, and other things useful to the learned world, cannot fail of contributing very much to the success of the voyage. In justice to the officers and the whole of the crew, I must say they have gone through the fatigues and dangers of the whole voyage with that cheerfulness and alertness that will always do honour to British seamen, and I have the satisfaction to say that I have not lost one man by sickness during the whole voyage. I hope that the repairs wanting to the ship will not be so great as to detain us any length of time. You may be assured that I shall make no unnecessary delay either here or at any other place, but shall make the best of my way home. Banks too notes that there were no sick on board, and contrasts the rosy, healthy appearance of the crew with the pallid faces of the Europeans of Batavia. But on the 26th of October a series of disastrous entries commence in the journal. Set up the ship's tent for the reception of the ship's company. Several of them begin to be taken ill, owing, as I suppose, to the extreme hot weather. Batavia had an ill-omened reputation, and it had been estimated that from 1735 to 1755 no less than 1,000,000 deaths took place, chiefly from malarial fever and dysentery, and Cook had soon cause to regret that the Dutch had undertaken the repairs of the ship, leaving his men to look on. He knew well the evil effects of want of occupation in such a climate, though he could not guess what it was to cost him. Up to this point he had only 7 deaths to record since leaving Plymouth, 3 from drowning, 2 frozen, Mr. Banks' servants, 1 consumption, and 1 alcoholic poisoning, probably a record never equalled in the history of navigation. On the 5th of November Mr. Monkhouse, the surgeon, died, and Cook, Banks and Solander were very ill. The 2 last went up into the hills, but Cook would not leave his ship. Meanwhile the repairs went on. The ship was found to be worse than had been expected. 2 planks and a half had been rasped by the rocks to the thickness of 1/8 of an inch for a distance of 6 feet, and here the worms had made their way quite into the timbers, so that it was a matter of surprise to everyone who saw her bottom how we had kept her above water, and yet in this condition we had sailed some hundreds of leagues in as dangerous a navigation as in any part of the world, happy in being ignorant of the continual danger we were in. By the 14th her bottom was thoroughly repaired, and Cook speaks highly of the Dutch workmen. I do not believe there is a marine yard in the world where work is done with more alertness than here, or where there are better conveniences for heaving ships down, both in point of safety and dispatch. The water, a perquisite of the Commodore of the Dutch East Indian fleet, was very unsatisfactory, and was found to keep very badly at sea, although its keeping properties had been loudly vaunted by the Commodore. Cook was present at his appointment. One of the grandest sights Batavia afforded, that may be too, and yet it did not recompense us for our trouble. I thought that the whole was but ill conducted, and the fleet appeared to be very badly manned. A seaman who had run from a Dutch ship entered on the Endeavour, was claimed by the Dutch on the grounds that he was a Dane from Elsinore. Cook promised he should be given up if he proved not to be a British subject. An inquiry by Hicks resulted in a report to the Governor that he was an Irishman, so the matter was dropped. His name was James Mara, and he will be again met with as gunner's mate on the Resolution. Death of Tupia. Before leaving Batavia there had been 7 deaths, including Mr. Reynolds, artist, and Tupia and his boy servant, and Cook gives the number of sick as 40 or more. Hoping the sea breezes might have a beneficial effect, preparations were hurried forward, and they managed to leave the day after Christmas Day, being duly saluted by the garrison with 14 guns, and the Earl of Elgin with 13 guns and 3 cheers, all of which we had returned. Calling at Prince's Island in the Straits of Sunda, where some of the Batavian water was replaced by better, and sailors were allowed to purchase whatever they fancied in hopes of diminishing the dysentery, which was rampant. Every precaution that could be thought of was tried, but in vain. Mr. Banks lost Messrs. Sporing and Parkinson, and on the 29th of January Mr. Green died. He had been long ill, but Cook says he would not take proper care of himself. To judge from his own journal, he must have been rather a difficult man to get on with, but his services as observer were invaluable, and he, at all times and seasons, was devoted to his special duty. Indeed, at times he appears to have thought that every other work should give way to his. It is a somewhat suggestive fact that Banks hardly makes any reference to Mr. Green throughout his journal. On the 27th of February, the terrible list of losses was closed by the deaths of 3 of the crew, making in all 30 deaths since their arrival at Batavia. It was afterwards discovered that the season in Batavia had been unusually unhealthy, and several ships that had called in there had to report heavy losses. Cook says, "Thus we find that ships which have been little more than 12 months from England have suffered as much or more by sickness than we have done, who have been out near 3 times as long, yet their sufferings will hardly, if at all, be mentioned or known in England, when, on the other hand, those of the Endeavour, because her voyage is uncommon, will very probably be mentioned in every newspaper, and, what is not unlikely, with additional hardships we never experienced. For such are the dispositions of men in general in these voyages, that they are seldom content with the hardships and dangers which will naturally occur, but they must add others which hardly ever had existence but in their imaginations, by magnifying the most trifling accidents and circumstances to the greatest hardships and insurmountable dangers without the immediate interposition of Providence, as if the whole merit of the voyages consisted in the real dangers and hardships they underwent, or that the real ones did not happen often enough to give the mind sufficient anxiety. Thus posterity are taught to look upon these voyages as hazardous to the highest degree." at the Cape. On the 6th of March, land was sighted at daylight about 2 leagues away, near Cape Natal, and on the 15th the Cape of Good Hope was seen. The first thing to be done was to provide shelter ashore for his sick, of whom he landed 28, and during the stay the remainder of the crew were given every possible opportunity of being on land, as Cook recognised the value of an entire change of life in shaking off the remnants of sickness. He lost 3 more of his men here, and hearing from a Dutch ship just in from Europe that war was threatening between England and Spain, he hurried up his preparations for departure and got all his men on board, though some were still very ill. In addition, he managed to enter some half-dozen men for the voyage home. In writing of the Cape, Cook draws attention to the fact that a stranger is at once struck with surprise and disappointment, for no country we have seen this voyage affords so barren a prospect as this, and not only so in appearance but in reality. Then further on he says, notwithstanding the many disadvantages this country labours under, such as the industry, economy and good management of the Dutch, that not only the necessary but all the luxuries of life are raised here in great abundance and are sold as cheap, if not cheaper, than in any part of Europe, some few articles excepted. On the other hand, he complains of the exorbitant charges made by the Dutch East India Company for naval stores. As at Batavia, they were sold at a certain fixed price from which there was no deviation. Calling in at St. Helena, they found HMS's Portland and Swallow, with a convoy, in the roads, and received some few much-needed stores from them, together with the information that all danger of war between Spain and England was over. They all sailed in company on the 5th of May, but after a few days Cook explained to Captain Elliot of the Portland, who had come on board the Endeavour, that his ship, sails and rigging were naturally not in very good order after his lengthy voyage, and therefore he should probably be unable to keep up with the other ships. He requested the Portland to take charge of letters, charts and journals for the Admiralty. These papers only arrived in England 3 days in advance of the Endeavour. For some days the good bark kept within easy reach of the fleet, and was able to obtain extra medical advice for Mr. Hicks, who was suffering from consumption when he left England, but had held out well till stricken with the Batavian fever, when he gradually sank and died on the 25th of May. Mr. Charles Clerke was appointed 3rd Lieutenant in place of Mr. Gore, promoted. Since leaving the Cape they had also lost their master, Mr. Molyneux, of whose intelligence Cook speaks very highly, but deplores his want of steadiness, the true cause of his early death. Mr. Pickersgill was appointed to the vacancy. Anchor in the Downs. On the 21st of June they were still in sight of some of the convoy, but during the night they had their main topgallant sail split, and the topmast sprung, in a heavy squall. In fact, their gear was in such a bad state that something gave way daily. On the 7th of July they spoke a brig from London, 3 days out from Sicily, and learnt that no account of their proceedings had yet been made public, and that wagers were being laid that the Endeavour was lost. On the 10th of July Nicholas Young, who had sighted New Zealand, sighted the Land's End, and the Lizard was seen the next day. On Saturday the 13th of July 1771, at 3 o'clock in the PM, anchored in the Downs, and soon after I landed in order to repair to London. Before leaving, Cook wrote to Mr. Stephens informing him of his arrival, and announcing that he was coming up to the Admiralty to lay before their Lordships a full account of the whole voyage, and that the ship was to wait further orders. He hopes that the appointments that he has made will meet with approval, and requests that his charts, plans and drawings may be laid before the authorities. On the 2nd of August, Stephens wrote to him at Mile End, saying he had received the papers sent from Batavia, those by the Portland and those from the Downs, and that they had been laid before their lordships. He goes on, "I have the pleasure to acquaint you that their lordships extremely well approve of the whole of your proceedings, and that they have great satisfaction in the account you have given them of the good behaviour of your officers and men, and of the cheerfulness and alertness with which they went through the fatigues and dangers of their late voyage." He also notifies at the same time that the appointments made have all been confirmed. Cook himself was appointed commander of the Scorpion on the 29th of August, but owing to other arrangements being made, did not put in an appearance on his new ship. Isaac Smith and Isaac Manley were appointed respectively master's mate and midshipman, taking part in the second voyage, being too young for further promotion. The newspaper, of course, blossomed out into paragraphs on the subject of the voyage, more or less correct, and Bingley's Journal on the 23rd of July stated, "In consequence of this discovery, more ships will be destined in search of this new terrestrial acquisition." Evidently, it was quickly decided that Cook's rest was to be short. On the 27th, the same journal says, "His Majesty's ship the Endeavour, which is lately arrived in the river from the East Indies, lost by the unhealthiness of the climate 70 of her hands, though they were picked men, and some had been several times in the Indies. However, those who survive will have made their fortunes by traffic, having brought home some of the richest goods made in the East, which they are suffered to dispose of without the inspection of the custom house officers. This, our correspondent says, is allowed them by the government as a reward for their hard and dangerous service during the voyage of 3 years. The amount of the richest goods made in the East obtained from New Zealand, Australia and Otaheite would be but a poor reward for 3 years' strenuous service, and Cook here finds his premonition as to his losses being exaggerated only too true. It is worthy to note that the number of punishments throughout the voyage was remarkably small, those entered in the ship's log being 21, and the heaviest sentence 24 lashes for theft. In one case, that of Matthew Cox, A.B., for disobedience and mutinous conduct, the culprit proceeded civilly against Cook on arrival in England, and the Admiralty solicitors were instructed to defend. The case was probably allowed to drop as no result can be found. Last of the Endeavour. The good ship, which had so bravely borne her part, was not given much rest, but after being paid off at Woolwich, was dispatched under Lieutenant James Gordon to the Falkland Islands on the 16th of October, and returned with perishable and unserviceable stores. In 1772 and 1773 she again made voyages to the same destination, the last one to bring away the garrison and stores, as those islands were to be handed over to Spain. She was paid off at Woolwich in September 1774, and shortly afterwards was sold out of the Navy for the sum of £645. She is then believed to have been employed as a collier in the North Seas. Mr. Gibbs of the firm of Gibbs and Canning of Newport, Rhode Island, one day pointed out to the English consul the remains of an old vessel falling into decay, and informed them that it was Captain Cook's ship, the Endeavour. His story was that the French government, being anxious to compete with England in the whale fishery, offered a bounty to the ships in that trade sailing under the French flag. A Mr. Hayden purchased the old ship from a Dunkirk firm and rechristened her La Liberté, loading her with oil, and consigned her under French colours to Gibbs and Canning at Newport. She was chased by an English ship, but escaped, and after laying alongside a wharf for some months, received a cargo, but running aground in trying to leave the harbour, she was found in such a bad condition that she was allowed to remain to drop to pieces. Inquiries into this story gave satisfactory results, and a box made from her timbers was presented to J. Fenimore Cooper, the American author, with letters authenticating, as far as possible, the vessel from which the wood had been taken. Miss Cooper mentions this box in her preface to her father's Red Rover, and several other relics of the old ship are still to be found in the neighbourhood of Newport. End of chapter 11.